from the registration form. So thanks to all of you for sharing those beforehand. And yeah, that's about it. Please keep your mics on mute while we present. But again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we look forward to a great Q&A session after today's presentations. Maybe it's time to get started. What do you think, David?
Yep, sounds good.
All right. Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar, The Shifting Manufacturing Dynamic in Vietnam, Staying Ahead of the Wave, brought to you by Business Sweden in Vietnam. My name is Marcus Persson. I am a project manager here at Business Sweden Vietnam, and I'm also heading up our new office in Ho Chi Minh City. And I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Business Sweden has spent quite a lot of time during the last months doing research related to the manufacturing sector. And we have been in contact and interviewed a number of relevant and important stakeholders in the market. So today we will present the main findings from our research, and we will talk about Vietnam's attractiveness as an emerging production hub. And we will also provide you with practical insights on opportunities in Vietnam, challenges with diversifying supply chain to Vietnam, how to build supplier ecosystems, and so forth. And we will also deep dive into metal, plastic fabrication, focusing on current development, input materials, the availability of input materials, technical capabilities, key stakeholders, and last but not least, the government's policy. So if we have a look at today's agenda, here it is. David, Trade Commissioner, Sweden's Trade Commissioner to Vietnam, will give you the key findings from our study. And then we will hand over the word from to some experience sharing. So we have Binh Trung, Vice President and General Secretary for Vietnam Association for Supporting Industries, VASI. And after that, we have Giap Nguyen, HR Resource Senior Manager at Assa Abloy Vietnam. And for our Q&A sessions, we also have the core project team from Hanoi, Nguyen Dam, consultant at our Hanoi office, and Huyen Quan, working with me here in Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, so without further ado, I will hand over the word to David for the key findings, please.
Very good. So we are going to talk about Vietnam as an emerging production hub. Thank you for a very good introduction, Marcus. And I kind of have a personal connection of Vietnam as an emerging production hub. One of the reasons I'm here in this role is because where I see Vietnam being right now is actually very similar to and of course, this is something that everybody says, but where China was maybe 15, 20 years ago or so. And it just so happens that roughly 17, 18 years ago, I was living in Shanghai then as a student. But it's really kind of a special time in a country's economic development when you're going through this period of rapid growth, a lot of investments coming in and being done locally. And I like to describe it with it's kind of a cultural phenomenon where basically every single person you know, even no matter if they're a CEO or if they are working at a factory floor or anything of the like, most people feel this economic growth in their day-to-day lives and go to bed thinking that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And that's a very, very special place to be. But given that we are not, through this industrial transformation yet, there are, of course, issues still to be managed, and we would like to discuss some of those with you today. And as a note, we're calling this one the shifting the manufacturing dynamic in Vietnam, staying ahead of the wave. The wave here, I think probably most of you are already aware about, but the amount of FDI investments coming into Vietnam are basically unparalleled. It's a lot of investments coming in. We're going to go through a few examples, but also one that we didn't include in the slide deck is only, I think, 2-3 days ago, LG announced a commitment to invest another $4 billion USD into the country for manufacturing. So that's kind of the wave we're talking about. A lot of countries are focusing on Vietnam as a production hub, and thus we want to see how we can use this best for Swedish manufacturing as well. So let's dive right into it. So if you go to the next slide, just as a high level overview, we think that it is very logical what's happening. Vietnam has had a stable and resilient economy also throughout COVID. Here, I mean, the most telling story of it is perhaps the Q3 GDP growth numbers for 2022, where coming back and recovering from 2021, which actually had COVID lockdowns, we saw GDP growth last quarter of 14%, which is just extreme numbers, right? There are also a lot of supportive policies coming for FDI and specifically for manufacturing, and there's a little bit of complexity here that it needs to be in specific industries and with specific focus. But still, the government is very much focused on incentivizing investment and continue pushing growth through FDI. This, of course, goes through to strong growth in basically all economic indicators. You see consistently high GDP growth, which, and this is important to point out, which is actually not coupled with extremely low interest rates and fiscal stimuli. I guess you could call the FDI inflow some kind of fiscal stimuli, but this is kind of like a consensus-driven growth rather than just investment from a central bank. There are still cost advantages. There is some complexity and nuance to this as well. Can say that right now that there is complexity and nuance to all of this. Vietnam is still very much, kind of formulating both its industrial strategy and what that means in terms of implementation. But at very base level, the cost base is relatively low in Vietnam still, which makes it, at least at face value, very attractive. There is also significant investment into infrastructure. What you will see in the breakdowns is that still a lot of manufacturing is focused either around the south region, around Ho Chi Minh, or in the Red River Delta up around Hanoi. But this is something that the government wants to change and build broader opportunities for the entire country, which means that infrastructure will be a key investment area for the government going forward as well. And this means that we have impressive growth of the ecosystems supporting these major manufacturing investments. And as I said, there is nuance here as well. It's not a one-stop shop where you could compare maybe China in its current development, which has seen extreme FDI and internal development of their own manufacturing base for the last 20-30 years. Vietnam is much earlier in this journey. So there is good growth, but it's not as easy as it is in China. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about, why we're seeing a lot of interest in this topic of manufacturing in Vietnam. And that is, of course, because of the complexity that is arising in terms of APAC manufacturing. During 2020 and 2021, mainly driven by lockdowns and kind of disruptive governmental policies which were not synchronized between countries or even regions, meaning that the very, very fine-tuned kind of just-in-time system that we've been living in kind of grinded a little bit to a halt for a while, and production output went like a bullwhip effect, whereas, for instance, logistics costs went through the roof. Now they're coming back down, but most economists that we're listening to don't believe we're really going to go back to the very, very optimized and efficient supply chains that we've had up until the COVID disruption. But looking at this, in Vietnam, of course, there's slight disruption as well. But if we go to the next slide, in spite of all of this, Vietnam has actually been able to have quite persistent growth in spite of the disruptive forces. And here I would like to reiterate one more time that those of you who follow macroeconomic policy closely have, of course, known that we've seen growth numbers in a lot of countries which have been fueled by cheap financing locally from a central bank. And that is very important to point out that that has not happened in Vietnam. So even during, the kind of more turbulent years, we've seen growth in productive output coupled with actually relatively controlled inflation. Even though most of the world is now going towards double digits, we see relatively controlled inflation in Vietnam, kind of similar to what we had in China once upon a time. But this also means, for those who haven't followed Vietnam that closely, that in the last only 20, 30 years, a lot of impressive developments have actually been achieved by this country. We've highlighted a few of them at the bottom of this slide, where in 1993, 58.1% were below the poverty line, and now poverty is virtually eradicated, with that number being less than 3%. And this is due to the ability of Vietnam to maintain the growth even in this kind of unstable and more insecure environment. And this leads to, if we go to the next slide, a large interest from a lot of companies. Now, as I said, we didn't have the time to update it with the LG investments and the previous ones from Samsung, but just some examples here of the companies coming in. It is, the larger industrial giants, a lot of focus on electronics manufacturing. Already we've had Samsung here for a very long time. But since we're talking about, the Swedish perspective, I would also personally like to highlight Lego right now, who just this year did the groundbreaking ceremony for the largest Lego plant ever to be built in Vietnam. This means that if we go to the next one, if you look at the FDI, it's almost entirely manufacturing. And that is because a lot of these companies have this rationale that it's the new kind of deflationary pressure, which we once saw in China, moving manufacturing to Asia. And this means that year on year, you see the GDP growing and manufacturing is actually increasing its share of GDP. And if we go to the next slide, we also see that this is mainly export driven. We have the relatively established sectors. We have the textile, garments, footwear, and associated parts industries, which, in spite of being relatively large in terms of export value, still have seen quite impressive growth of 24%. You also have the phones, mainly driven by the giant Samsung, growing at 50% in the last 5 years here. But then, other areas, and the ones perhaps that we're going to focus on, for instance, machinery, instrument, and accessories, have seen an impressive growth in the period between 16 and 20. And as you can see, it's very much focused on building stuff here, getting actually the value out of that deflationary pressure to make cheaper exports available to the world. And a little bit more nuance on that is, if you look at the metrics for Vietnam, if you compare Vietnam to perhaps a country like Laos or Cambodia, then it's not the same kind of profile, because in spite of having relatively low labor cost and low investment levels, low investment cost, I should say, to get your manufacturing up and running, there is already relatively good systems developed. It's not as good as the more mature ones like China and Singapore or Taiwan, but relatively good and more advanced at a relatively affordable price. And this, we believe, is only going to keep growing. If we go to the next slide, there's been a lot of focus on building out the infrastructure in the country, because when you have this export-driven agenda, as Vietnam is showing, you will need to have good infrastructure to, at a cheaper price, be able to get it to international ports, to get it out to all of the markets you are serving. In recent decades, actually, this has been perhaps disproportionately focused in the north, focusing on growing marine exports, but also building land routes to China, whereas the south have traditionally had better infrastructure and is stated to have a stronger focus in perhaps the decade to come. And these are just some examples of the projects underway right now. And in addition to this, if we go to the next one, it's also then incentivizing the building of industrial parks. Most of the foreign companies coming here, of course, don't want to build their entire ecosystem on their own. And like most industrializing countries, you do this through the development of economic zones and industrial parks. There are already economic zones available predominantly in the south, but also now building in the north, and more of them are planned to be developed. Because one thing that you can see in the short term in Vietnam is that although prices have been relatively low, there has been a quick increase in, for instance, land cost and labor cost, due to the kind of concentration into a few sites. And this is what the government is trying to counteract, to maintain relatively good cost levels and spread the kind of workload across the country. So if we look a little bit about the nature of Vietnam's manufacturing, we can go to the next slide, where due to the heavy focus on electronics and then, of course, phones, as we saw in the export graph, Vietnam actually has a very high share of high-tech exports in the region, almost at 40% here in 2020. But what is important to keep in mind is that this does not mean that all of Vietnam has now become, the Silicon Valley of the world, but rather it's the nature of the FDI coming in. So a lot of the major players who have the financial and organizational muscle to build up completely new operations have seen the business case really making sense for doing assembly and then building backwards throughout the value chain. This means then, if you look at the right-hand side, that still the domestic value add for all of this manufacturing is still relatively low. And this is something that the government is very keen on changing, so that we can have GDP growth by using more capabilities domestically within the country. And on a high level, if we go to the next slide, this means that for select industries, there are policies in place. Here we have an example of Decree 111, that supporting industries are the ones who are going to increase the amount of value add for select industries that are already growing. And thus, they are incentivized with cuts in enterprise income tax, preferred import tariffs in order to be able to build these industries. And also the land use taxes are preferential if you invest into building manufacturing development in the industries that will increase the value add within Vietnam. At the same time, if we look at the next slide, the Ministry of Science and Technology is then focused on really trying to steer this in a scientific way. Here we have just an example for how the Vietnamese government is thinking about this. And then they are studying it according to kind of maturity ladders and building up capabilities. What is good to know is that, the Ministry of Science and Technology are also saying that, we're still developing, there are still gaps need to be filled, and we need to pinpoint our efforts in order to grow. And when we go into the deep dives here soon, you'll see that this means that it's steered in very different ways in different industries. But there is an agenda to steer it, and it is being tracked, and there is awareness that we're still not there, and there's still work to do. So that is kind of the overview, if we go to the next one, of why Vietnam is an emerging production hub and why there is interest to explore it as a production hub. It's not only the low cost, it's also the government incentives, the infrastructure investments, and also the wave of big FDI coming in, predominantly from Japan and Korea, but also now China, looking to invest even more in Vietnam. There is some complexity to be managed. And if you have any questions, please note them down, and Marcus will take care of it. And we will handle those in the Q&A session at the end. So now let's dive into the metal processing deep dive. And basically here, what is good to know is that it is challenging to understand a complete industry in Vietnam. Digitalization is still at relatively low levels. It is still very much a network-based economy. Just as a kind of an anecdote that gives you an example is that we, of course, help a multitude of Swedish companies to work not only to increase exports to Vietnam, but also to do sourcing here, right? And just one anecdotal example is that one perfect supplier for a plastics manufacturing company that we found for a mid-sized Swedish firm was actually just a friend of the owner of one of the companies that was actually listed in one of the association databases. So it is hard to map it, but we have still spent the time to do so. And what is good to know is that in metal manufacturing, an overwhelming majority are very, very small. And if you look at the larger ones, it is FDI companies who are supporting basically the large consumer goods manufacturers from Japan and Korea that are coming in. Major challenges here is, and this is kind of a recurring theme that you see in manufacturing in Vietnam, is that Vietnam still needs imports of raw materials and input materials to manufacturing. In the metal space, it is mainly import of steel and non-ferrous alloys from China, Japan, and Korea. And it is incentivized by the government to build up this capability, but there are still some gaps. We have worked also with a much, much larger Swedish industrial goods manufacturer, and then went into kind of deep detail on this. And if you have specific requirements, it can be quite challenging in the near term, whereas in a few years, most likely this will have changed. Also, and this is also a recurring theme that you see from manufacturing in Vietnam in general, where technically the capabilities are here. And you will still have to do the quality assurance process setup and such, but there is not really anything hindering this value-added growth in terms of know-how and capability, but rather it is that when you move up the value chain, the volumes that are done in, for instance, China, which is the major competitor for this kind of investment, the economies of scale are just completely different yet, meaning that you have to build it with, where you have the cost advantages, and then backwards to kind of build on that ecosystem. But as we see on the bottom right here, it is also very much incentivized by the government to build these capabilities. So then geographical breakdown, if we go to the next slide, as I said, it is quite a fragmented market to a very large extent. If you look at the share of manufacturing companies that work in metals, it's roughly 19% and only make up. So the number of companies, this is, a company of one person is counted just as much as a company of 300 people. So then you have roughly 19% of the registered organizations are metal manufacturers in Vietnam. And the net turnover is only 5%. And according to our view, this is because most of it is very, very basic services and work. It's yet to consolidate, except for the very large ones. You can see in the top right that even though maybe 1% of the metal manufacturing companies are larger than 300 people, they employ 34% of the workforce in this sector. So we see continued growth in this, and mainly it's driven by local private, and some parts are, the FDI and foreign owned. State-owned is still a relatively small share. And even though there are investments into developments for the rest of the country, it's still very much focused on both the north region around Hanoi and the south region around Ho Chi Minh City. Then just if we go to the next slide, just some examples here, right? So if we look at the largest companies that are coming in, so for instance, Fina MS Vina Company Limited, major supplier to Samsung. You have another Japanese company supplying VMPT and Vietel, so the large state-owned Vietnamese companies building infrastructure. Then there are another few companies that sell to provincial authorities. And first, when you get down to Vietnam Environment Mechanical JSC and Viet Steel, you have the privately owned ones. So still very strong focus on the FDI, where the large local companies will typically sell to a very, very big FDI company or to the provincial authorities. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that in terms of input materials, the trend has been that imports have overshadowed exports by quite a large extent. What we see in recent years is that imports are actually going down and exports are going up, meaning that this is slowly being built due to the incentivization by the government. It is also something that consistently comes up when you talk about kind of, let's say, regional risks, where a lot of stakeholders in this region are getting slightly wary about being too dependent on one large country in China. It doesn't mean that China is, not a good sourcing destination, because for very many categories, China is still by far the best in the world. But a lot of companies, at least that we speak to, are slightly worried about being too dependent on them. And this is something that the Vietnamese market for metal input goods such as stainless steel and the rolled coil steel are focusing on to kind of bridge that gap. There are policies in place, but we're still working to kind of invert those curves. And then if we go to the next slide, we can also see the deep drill down of the MOST mapping of the metal manufacturing capabilities of Vietnam. And here, what is very key to note is that when it comes to metals, we are building the bubble kind of from the middle and then evenly expanding it, trying to build the entire value chain at the same time. This is something that is quite different from what we'll see in plastics manufacturing. But this means, at least at face value here when looking at the study, that generally you should be able to build a semi-advanced complete value chain for metal manufacturing in the country. So just quickly looking at the policies here. So as I've mentioned, there is a policy to decrease the dependency on imports of, for instance, steel and rolled coil and alloys, which is set by IDC and pushed by governmental agencies. There are also incentives to increase technology and automation, and also larger value add in the manufacturing and processing industry for specific segments. Here, there are also, in addition to the governmental agencies, industry associations supporting this. And here, I think Ms. Bing from VASI will tell us more about what that means in practice after my little section here. And also in terms of output products for manufacturing, there is a very clear agenda from the Vietnamese government that we need to increase the use of domestically produced components to build this value add that we actually have in Vietnam. And this is also good to think about, supported by the large corporations coming in and then bringing with them the kind of ecosystems to build these capabilities. So it's kind of a tripartite alliance here, where you have the associations, the government, and the companies trying to work together to implement these decrees in order to make the vision come true with a higher value add in Vietnam. So that's basically the, let's say, bird's eye view of metal manufacturing in Vietnam. And I'm sure it's a lot of complexity here that we have not gone into, but we are very happy to discuss that later in the Q&A. Then, if we move into plastics precision manufacturing, here we see a quite similar picture. There is a lot of small companies. You have some really large ones which are supporting the big players, and basically all of it, or the lion's share of it, is FDI and non-state players. So it's not state-owned. It's mainly private investments. But also here we see a high reliance on imported materials in order to be able to run plastics manufacturing. And here there are clear policies to also get the input goods into plastics manufacturing to be sourced more locally. Also here, when talking to experts in this field, basically they say it's not that hard actually. We have all the capabilities, but still there is an issue with scale. They are seeing, increased demand coming in, mainly due to some shaky situation up north in the Middle Kingdom in China. But still, the economies of scale that have built up in China during the last 3 decades still produce a very cost-efficient solution there. So If we look at the same structure in the next slide for the companies, we see basically exactly the same thing. It's not super differentiated. Most of the workforce work for either small companies or for the really, really large ones, where the mid segment is not that huge. Here you have a little bit more extreme divide, where 0.7% of the companies that work in plastics manufacturing and have more than 1,000 employees, but that amounts to 33% of the workforce in plastics manufacturing. And if we go on to the examples on the next slide, you have large local private supplying in large FDI companies. Also the joint venture of, for instance, ITM Semiconductor supplying Samsung and LG. Most likely they will have even more to do after the $4 billion have been poured into new manufacturing for LG. But it's a relatively similar picture. Here you have the first state-owned one, first at the bottom, supplying Vietnam Post, VNPT, and Viettel. So same kind of story here. There is still a dependence on import of raw materials for plastics manufacturing, but production just keeps growing. And if we can increase the amount of domestic materials being used, which looks like it might happen if you look at the import graph on the top left of the 4 boxes to the right here, imports are going down where annual output is going up. Exports are not increasing yet, but that leads us to believe that more domestic input materials are being used. And here, please correct me if I'm wrong, team, but I think it's specifically on PP and PT, where the major categories where we want to increase the self-sustainability of Vietnam for plastic manufacturing. Then, also looking at the kind of capability structure for plastics manufacturing. And here I really want to contrast it with what we saw in metals. So if you look at the same kind of overview of capabilities, here it's a much more diversified picture, where domestic assembly, for instance, is at the level of world class. Perhaps this is why Lego already see the potential in Vietnam. But there are several areas within plastics manufacturing where the capabilities are just not there. There have not been any investments into it, and it's just kind of a gap in the capability profile. Whether or not this will increase in terms of capability is mainly dependent on whether there is someone wanting to bet on it, right? And for instance, with Lego, we would expect that, for instance, mold assemblement perhaps might increase in the future when they need local supply of molds. But I think the quotes here are pretty telling, right? So they show a very clear picture. So for instance, if we look at Ho Chi Minh City Mechanical Electrical Enterprise Association, the chairman says that there is no lag behind in terms of techniques. The only disadvantage is about, the cost of having to import materials. We don't have the self-sufficiency or the economy of scale, so we aren't dominating the category yet. And that means that looking here at the kind of final slide for the plastics manufacturing, we want to increase the input materials in order to increase the value add and be able to build these economies of scale. Also here, it's a trifecta of governmental and state-owned organizations trying to push this together with the industry organizations, but also by the MNCs. So that's a pretty similar picture actually to what we see. We are doing well in the final part of the value chain. Unfortunately, this is not high enough value add, meaning that if we want to keep the GDP per capita growth growing and keep all people thinking that tomorrow is going to be better than today, then directed investments into manufacturing capabilities of the upstream ecosystems will be necessary in plastics as well. And that's kind of Vietnamese metal and plastics manufacturing in 30 minutes. I hope I was kind of okay on time. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so let's take those at the Q&A at the end. But there, I would like to, if you go to that one, thank you for your attention and hand the word back over to Marcus.
Thank you, David. Very interesting indeed. Yes, as anticipated earlier, we will now go move forward to the experience sharing session, where we will get the real voices from the market, from people that actually working with this on a daily basis. So first out, Bin Trong, Vice President and General Secretary at VASI. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hello. Good afternoon, people, and good morning from Europe. Um, Thank you so much for the presentation of David. It's very comprehensive, but also very in detail in manufacturing in Vietnam. And I just want to sharing with you just some, information about how we can get success linkage between FDI firms and local firms in Vietnam. So VASI is an association of Vietnam companies producing parts and components. And we have now about 1,000 members who producing such kind of product. And the majority is in metal processing with, 70%, like David's presentation. The second part is plastic and rubber. And the E&E electronic and electrical is just 10%. Even for Samsung is a giant electronics guys in Vietnam. We just provide mostly in metal parts and plastic parts. We have only about one or two or three supplier, Vietnamese supplier producing for them in electronics parts. So you can see the main products in the right figure, and so they are mainly in mechanical engineering. So we are now qualified in supplying to the MNC's buyers in Vietnam in some important manufacturing such as motorcycle, electronics, automotive, automobiles, and other. And we also export to the world, mainly to Asia, and starting to export to Europe and North America. Even though we have experience with international buyers and gain out the international standards, like even IATF 16949, it is not easy to have successful linkage with the new potential customers. If you are considering to invest in Vietnam and need to looking for local suppliers in manufacturing sector, you may consider our learnings. As Vasi experience in working with MNCs and FDI firms in a long time, there are three most important criteria from the buyer side that impact much on gaining the successful linkage. You can see in the next slides. Um, so the first thing is the most important is production volume. You all know that most of companies in supporting industry needs mass production. That's the reason the motorcycle industry in Vietnam has the highest localization rate. It's nearly 100%. It's about 95 or 99. Since the volume market is always large and stable in last 15 years. And it's the same attractive products in mobile phones. So some of the MNCs share information on global supply needs for all countries, not only in Vietnam. For example, Panasonic Vietnam, they have 6 factories in the country, and each of them had separate purchasing department for its factory. Meanwhile, the Panasonic headquarters in Thăng Long Industrial Zone in Hanoi had the global purchasing department in Vietnam, but they have a global purchasing department, which five Vietnam suppliers for their common needs of Panasonic Vietnam and for their global demands. Of course, the requirement could be different and normally is more tough, but it is really that the best way to develop local suppliers that is owning the huge production volume. Um, so in case your company could, or so in case it's impossible, please share the global market needs with Vietnam supplier. So it's our opportunity for to reach out your needs. And the next one, the next slide is the other very important factor. Is you should have to, that is a clear localization plan. When you want to invest in Vietnam, sure that you have to consider many factors that David mentioned in his presentation, but you also consider about the supplying capability of Vietnamese firm and local firms here. So we say that if you have a clear and stable plan to localization, it's much better, because you know that the local manufacturers, they have to invest much, and they are mostly SME, small and medium size. So that the plan is very important. You can see the figure here as an example of Toyota Vietnam. It reports the localization products and steps of Toyota Vietnam from the beginning in 1997. The other investor, for example, Skoda from Slovakia, they even reach out with us 2 years before they enter in Vietnam about the localization uh, plan, and um, you know, they want to research about the supplying capability of Vietnamese firm here, or even FDI firms in Vietnam, not only Vietnamese firm. And you know that many of them, of MNCs and FDI firms, they share those informations like Toyota Vietnam with the government partners, and of course with their existing and potential suppliers to see the picture. You know, the plan surely needs approval from Toyota headquarters in Tokyo, and the agreements of Toyota at other countries like Thailand or Indonesia. That's the reason that it's not easy for the Toyota Vietnam to get such kind of plan, but they 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 did that. In fact, they still chain along the timeline in Vietnam. Amendment, add some more, remove some parts, but generally they show the motivation to develop and expand supplying from Vietnamese firms, instead of always thinking about importing from Japan, China, Thailand, and etc. So this is very important for us to get the successful linkage. And the last one, the third, is about the strategy, the efforts, and particular actions to develop local suppliers. You know that our firms, they are completely unfamiliar with your company's production methods and quality management requirements. Even they producing something for Samsung or Canon Vietnam or Toyota, but they are unfamiliar with Lego, for example, or Skoda. Therefore, even though they are already being supplied to other giant manufacturing players, they may still need support to close this gap as quickly as possible and to make the deals to success as quickly as possible. Currently, the capability of Vietnamese company has improved a lot compared to 5 or 10 years ago. So this supporting is more limited. So, but we need such kind of efforts. You know that the FDI firms entering Vietnam from 20 years ago have struggled to develop Vietnam suppliers because we have little manufacturing experience. And besides that, the long-term plan economy market is rare to have private enterprises. But even though most of FDI firms in Vietnam have purchasing department in which the engineering team could be sent to potential supplier in some months, even a year, to escort them to meet the needs, the requirement, technical requirement, and international standard. Some FDI company like Samsung or Toyota, they have the program to develop local firms that training, coaching them in 6 months or in 1 year, even in 2 years, depending on the components or on technology. By some products, by some component for Samsung, they need 2 years to escort the supplier. And another way, another effective way to linkage with local firms is through tier one vendors. You can see the pyramid here. You know, the tier one vendor in Vietnam are mainly FDI's companies, like for Samsung, that is Korean firms, for Toyota is Japanese firm, but also Taiwanese firm is also typical here. Um, mm, and they have better experience in doing with you and with MNCs in Vietnam. Um, you can see here the production network of Honda Vietnam. Honda Vietnam for motorcycle. It's not for the guys for motorcycle. They have not only tier 2, tier 1, but also tier 3, tier 4. So this is the very effective way to develop the local firms. And you know, many of our firms, they can step up from the tier 2 to tier 1 or to tier 3 to tier 2. That's why this is the best way to have a supply chain more strongly. So in case you don't have enough resources for the third factors or third content, that strategy or action to develop a supplier, you could we could support you. Don't worry about it. The most important thing is that you have a good market volume, production volume, and you want to localize in Vietnam instead of importing everything, or at least you have a plan to produce parts and components in Vietnam. Just let us know your plan so we can support you. So the next slide, you can see the program of the government. It's just an example that David mentioned before. This slide shows an example of the effort of the Ministry of Industry and Trade in improving capability of local firms complying with the international buyer. So there are some four main program here. Uh, you can see it later. Uh, Connecting, matching, and support training and coaching in quality management, and also R&D, application of technology, and so on. And not only the MOIT, but we also have program of the Ministry of Science and Technology, focusing on technology, Ministry of Planning and Investment, focusing on management skill. And VICE is one of the implementing agency here, and we follow this program in last 5 years, and we gain so much effectiveness for our members and other companies. And not only the government, but also here, the next slide, you can see the effort of the local government in provinces. It example of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the main um, manufacturing area of the country, and also the NGO project with the World Bank, for example, or USAID. Um, Recently, we also have a project by GIZ, the German government, on support Vietnamese company to follow the supply chain due diligence by the German government and Europe regulations. It's just very new for Vietnamese firm. This is due diligence in when you are joining a supply chain of MNCs in the world. So in next year, it's not only the challenging for local firm is not only international standards or requirement of the buyers, but also the requirement of government, of European government in due diligence, in environment, in HR, CSR, and so on. So you can see here the some activities like FBC Hanoi since 2018, or MTech Japan. That's why Hanoi, they put many effort on linkage between local firms with international buyer, not only inside the country but also in uh, abroad. And Ho Chi Minh City, they have a support industry supplier day exhibition. They do so well. It's most of big buyers in the country in manufacturing industry. You can present in this exhibition, and there are many B2B matching events. Even our VASI, we organize normally, uh, 2 months, each 2 months, B2B matching with buyers and potential buyer, not only in Vietnam but also exporter. The next one, research about actually we know about EU market. It's not very unfamiliar with us, with VASI members. We have experience in Hanover Messe in 2015, Midas in Paris, EICMA. This is a trade fair for motorcycle. Or yeah, EICMA and Hanover Messe is the most important exhibition of manufacturing, Vietnamese manufacturing industries. So we know well about the requirement of EU market, but follow and to meet is not easy. After some participating in such kind of exhibition in Europe, some of us have order from Germany, Italy, France, like metal products for households, mechanical hand tools, or especially in providing spare parts and components for motorcycle and bicycle. This is our area that Vietnam have advantage. And the last slide is about VASI activities. We do all activity in enhancing our members to comply with international buyers and requirements of buyers and connect them to potential buyer. But this is one of new activity in 2000 next year. So we will have a VASI sourcing tours free for all of you. The tour is aiming to introduce our best local firms in different fields like metal processing, including stamping, welding, hot casting, cold casting, surface machining, plastic and rubber supplier, electronic and electrical automation system, and so on. Even printing, packaging, etc. as your requirements. So the visitor is potential buyers, potential investors, commercial counselor from different embassies in Vietnam, like from Sweden embassy. You know that this is initiative come from the study tour with the guys from Swedish team here. Thank you so much for support us. And we also support overseas Vietnam commercial counselors. They also connect us with the global market. That's why we will do this tour in person. But in case you could not come here to Vietnam, you can also support you to visit our factories online. So just quick information about some experience in linkage. It's many details and complicated to explain. But if you have any question or more, you need more information, you can drop in the box, and then we can gain and reply you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bin. Very appreciated. Well, hopefully some of our participants will participate during your upcoming sourcing tours. We'll let you know if we get any interest from that. Now to one of our, let's say, one of our Swedish manufacturing companies already present with production in Vietnam. Today with us we have Jap Gwen, HR Resource Senior Manager at Assa Abloy. Please, Jap.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and good morning from Sweden. David and Ms. Bing already shared with you many information about Vietnam for the potential investment. And we are the manufacturing company which we already come to operation 3 years ago. And today I will share something about the experience for the operation in Vietnam after 3 years. Okay, so first, next, please. So before sharing some information, we would introduce very short, a little bit about our company. We are a Sweden company and located in Vĩnh Phúc, Yeah, the reason why we have the plant in Vietnam, Asabloy in Vietnam, is that we make the transition from China and Korea factory to Vietnam factory. And we close the business in China and Korea and move it all to Vietnam. But actually, we still have so many manufacturing plant and in Korea and China. And our product is smart digital door lock, which we export around 70% to the US, and remaining 30% is for Korea market and EMEA or some other small market. So total our volume per year is around 3 million pieces. And then also we have the sales office, which is located in Ho Chi Minh City. But products from our plant is 100% exported. So the sales team imported, or they import from a variety of other products which come from China and Korea and other countries, other factories also. So this is our factories. And today I will share with you just information about the workforce labor and the supply chains information. So as you know that we locate in Vĩnh Phúc, which is the north province of Hanoi, and our factory is located in the Mid Highland area, which Vĩnh Phúc is not developed like some other province surrounding like Hanoi or Bắc Ninh or Hải Phòng or Hải Dương, because Vĩnh Phúc is around more than 30 kilometers from by airport, and which is 150 kilometers from the Hải Phòng seaport. But in Vĩnh Phúc we have some big company that developed in Vietnam from start business from in Vietnam from the 1990s, such as Honda, Toyota, or Peugeot. They already start in Vĩnh Phúc in 1990s. So sharing about the information about the workforce in the provincial area, which is different with area with Hanoi and other developed province. So you know that Vĩnh Phúc, in the north of Vĩnh Phúc, there are many province which is a mountainous area. So that's the reason why the characteristic in Vĩnh Phúc and some this province is different with the workforce in Hanoi or some other big industrial park like in Bắc Ninh or Hải Dương. So this is the countryside area, and the province is growing, and we have many companies just new set up, especially for the Korean and Chinese company. They already set up new in Vĩnh Phúc, and also many company which is the vendor of the Samsung also located in Vĩnh Phúc. But we have some potential in that around before 10 years ago, you know that almost the labor from the mountainous area come, they come to Hanoi, or they come to some developed industrial park like in Hanoi or Bắc Ninh. But now this labor is moving back from the city to the countryside to work and live together with the family. So we have a variety of the workforce and the labor which is available in this area, and we can say that it is not difficult for the recruitment, and some company they or we don't have any difficulties when we increasing the products, and we need to gather the candidate or the workforce in rush time. And in this area, the labor is very young and abundant. And for the company that they have a big scale or big number of the employee, it is not easy for, not difficult for them to make the recruitment when they increase the production, even with some big time very quickly. And also that the cost of the living in the surrounding area, in this area, is very cheap. And then the people, almost the people is the family, and the worker, they come from the farmer. So that's the reason why they want to have the stable job. And if some company tend to have long-term contract with the employee, it is not difficult. Of course, in the north of because Vĩnh Phúc and other north province compared with other province is not developed, so we still have some challenges with the human resource. So you know that even we have abundant and even we have a young, but how can I say, the candidate and the worker is they themselves, because this one is a new areas, so the many employees, they still have a mind to change the company very easily. So that's the reason why we have some movement of the employee that today they work for this company, and if they have a chance, they wanna try in another company, and they try to select company which is the most suitable for them and they can work for a long time. So this is the trend of some young employee living in the mountainous area. And also for the high-tech labor resource abundant, we also have so many labor with the high-tech. However, they still focus in the city, and some hesitate to move to province for work. This one, like some high-tech engineering, some high-tech engineering, or some how can I say, some startup or some management member, they live in Hanoi, and some they hesitate to come to the province. So this is one of the challenges. But if we have anyone who come to the province to work, they will be worked a very long time. And also in this area, because almost the employee's family is the farmer, so still we have so they still have unemployment of the female workers, which is because compared with the male, they have to take the maternity leave, they have to stay at home to take care of the child, and we have so many employees that after they take the maternity leave, they want to stay at home longer compared with the compared with the regulated time. So even we have a young, even we have a abundant, but still we have some challenges in the provincial like Vĩnh Phúc. Okay, next please. So talking about the material supply chains, basically Asa Abloy already started operation in Vietnam 3 years ago, and until now we already transit around 60 or 70% of the material supplier from China to Vietnam. It means that we can move very quick number of the vendor from China to Vietnam. In the beginning time, we still need to import from China, but now almost we can buy from the local domestic vendor. So it means that in Vietnam, for the for the vendor who supply for the mechanical or supply for the electric is variety. We can have some choice. So in general information for supply chain that for the nickel die casting, Vietnam is very strong in aluminum die casting than zinc. Zinc is still we have some difficulties, but for aluminum die casting, it is not difficult to develop the supply chains system in Vietnam because the automotive industry in Vietnam is a very high demand. Use a lot of aluminum, so you can see that in the previous David and also Miss Bing already shared some big company in Vietnam because they already have some base requirement. So that's the reason why aluminum die casting is developed more than zinc in Vietnam. For the plastic injection, there are many injection supply in Vietnam also, but the raw material need to import. It means that we have the factory manufacturer in Vietnam, but the raw materials they still need to import from China, almost from China. So the price is sometimes is not so competitive. And also some like for the currency, many companies prefer to trade the trade in USD instead of the VND. So this is one of the character that the new investor can be refer. Payment terms compare with China is less than China. China is also around 90 days, and Vietnam almost is 45 days or 60 days. And about the location, so in the north of Vietnam, you know that Hải Phòng is very near the port and developed city and province. So if you developed in Vietnam for with the heavy products or with the and it affect to the transportation, you can consider about the location which is suitable for the plan for the strategy. Also, the other province like Bắc Ninh is they also very developed province, and lots of the energy supply in manufacturing was estimated there. So that is one of the potential area for you to consider when you make the investment. The reason why the reason why in Vĩnh Phúc they have so many vendors, but this vendor is almost the vendor is a supplied is a vendor of some big company in Vietnam, like the vendor of the Samsung, or the vendor of the Honda, the vendor of the Toyota or Peugeot. Okay, next please. So for the other information, like as you can see in the map, that we classify like the province that with the vendor spelling density and the province with the vendor density. So you can see in the south of including Hanoi and the south of Hanoi, some the province is with the density of the many of the vendor and the manufacturing company is more than in the north. So as we sharing information that the location is also one of the advantages of in the south, or labor workforce is one of the advantages in the north. So this one you can consider. For the price, it is varied from the different communities. Price compared with between the China and Vietnam. Sorry, China and Vietnam is around 80%. We still very cheap country compared with China, as David already share some information details. I think that for the direct labor cost will raise in Vietnam. It means that the increasing rate of the labor cost in Vietnam, we are still increasing even the rate is higher than China, but I think that still we very cheap compared with China. and even the increasing rate is more than China, but still we keep very long time to catch up with the China level. So if you invest in Vietnam for the labor cost, we don't have to worry about the, even we have an increasing rate in Vietnam is higher. For the technical capabilities, of course, China, they over this year, and they already have a mature in technology development skill. Vietnam, but in some field, Vietnam is now under developing and will be mature soon. So it is a very potential for the investment with the technical capability. So that's the reason why Vietnam and the north of Vietnam, we have many new company that they transit from China to Vietnam. And also for the electrics, of course, Vietnam still very behind, from China, and the company in Vietnam, they still relies heavily with China subsidiary companies to import the EE component into the China. So even we have a potential, we have some big vendor, we have some big company like a Samsung. Still, sometimes we have some. Still, sometimes we need more developed of the electronic vendor. But of course, if we have a requirement from each company, or from each very clearly from requirement from the company, we think that for the material supply chain, even electric or mechanical, it is not difficult to find out and to invest in Vietnam. So this is some experience that I can briefly sharing with you after we come to operation. So if you have any question, please don't hesitate.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing, Mr. Jap. Very interesting insights, and of course, hands-on experience from the market. We're now moving on to the Q&A session. I don't see any new questions here in the meeting chat, but please feel free to place your questions. We have a few questions from the pre-registration. I can actually post them here so we all look at the same thing. I think this goes out to my colleagues actually. So the question is, are there any upcoming investments of Swedish businesses in Vietnam? And in general, which sectors attract the most investments from Swedish companies? Who wanna give it a try?
Well, I can most definitely take a first step. So what we're seeing is, of course, the larger Swedish companies now wanting to diversify. So you already have manufacturing here. Polarium is here, for instance, working up an industrial park in Haiphong. They make, of course, energy storage solutions. We also have Hestra there. So you have the textiles and a little bit more electrification, high tech. Then we have the larger industrial companies looking into Vietnam. One which is discussions that I cannot divulge too much information about right now, but where we have a major Swedish industrial player evaluating Vietnam as a manufacturing base. At the same time, we have also another large industrial, let's say, component supplier for the automotive industry, looking to expand their presence here right now. And I think that currently you see that the larger kind of organizations, such as, for instance, Assa Abloy, are the ones who are invested more in manufacturing and setting up their own operations, whereas the smaller companies today are more interested in sourcing, finding local suppliers without setting up their own operations. And then, of course, it's a little bit more the smaller, simpler products, not rarely in the textiles or wood manufacturing, but also to some extent plastics is what we're seeing. But the larger investments are, of course, kind of naturally driven by the larger companies. And if you look at the larger companies in Sweden, most of them are in industrial goods. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Well, please, Ian, please add.
I would like to add further information for that. So as David mentioned, we have upcoming investment in automotive, right? Because maybe you have already witnessed the trend that we have been fast there, and a lot of European or US company, kind of the suppliers, they are moving to join the ecosystems. And yes, Swedish company, apart from joining the ecosystem, but they also want to kind of explore the further opportunities here. And then regarding energy, I would say Vietnam is now striving towards achieving COP26 commitments. So we also see Swedish companies in energy sector are also very keen on Vietnam market. And rather than sector-wise, we also witness this kind of trend. So we have Swedish company, they have clients diversifying production to Vietnam, for example. So I would take maybe Assa Abloy also experienced the same thing. When they move here, they also have their own supplier moving with them from Korea. So we actually have kind of accompany one Swedish company in their kind of research and site visit in Vietnam to explore the feasibility of establishing in Vietnam. So the reason why they're interested was that from a very informal discussion with their client, they see that their client is interested in maybe relocate or re-diversify their production in Vietnam. So they want to explore the opportunity and the feasibility of moving with their clients. So those are some trends that we witness during our day-to-day business.
Thank you, Ian. Any of the other panelists want to add something? Should we move on to next question? Let's move on to next question. All right. Also from the pre-registration. So what is the first step that we or a company should consider if they want to find suppliers in plastic processing? Maybe to all of the panelists. Ian, you want to go for it?
Yeah, so I was thinking that maybe Ms. Bing want to contribute it to these questions, because it's all about, consider when finding suppliers.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
If you want to find the plastic suppliers in Vietnam, I think it's not so difficult like mechanical engineering. So it depends on your products, what kind of product that you need, and the capacity of the machinery that you need for such kind of components. That is and the material that you need for the products. So that is the two things you have to consider first. Then based on that information, you can send such information to VASI, and then we can give you the short list of plastic suppliers in Vietnam. And based on that, you can choose, you can select which one you want to connect, and then we can create a B2B matching with you and our firms. It's not so difficult because plastic is, the processing technology is not complicated like metal processing. That's why we can provide full information to you. So in case you have a short list of products, you can send me now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bin. Any of my colleagues wants to comment?
No, I can only reiterate and agree actually what with Ms. Bing is saying. Most likely there are manufacturers who can produce the plastic products that you have, but also just tying it back to the overall trend we talked about in the beginning, right? So it's very important not only to look at what kind of product and what kind of volumes you're looking to source, but it's also very important to think through why are you looking for plastic suppliers, because it is very much dependent on if you're looking to cut cost, if you're looking to, for instance, take advantage of the new free trade agreements in Vietnam, which might give you very preferential cost. Is it about supply chain resilience? And also, how does it fit into the rest of your business? Is this plastic components? Is it something where you have a long-term plan to shift your manufacturing base? Or is it just to be able to source like a singular product which is not high level of complexity and high volume? So the key thing I always say when talking about the sourcing trends in APAC is that it used to be kind of a one-stop shop in China, and now it's just way more a messy and complex picture. I think for plastics in Vietnam, you can most likely find what you're looking for, but it's important to think, the long-term strategy as well.
All right. Thank you, David. Okay, no more comments. We are running out of time, but we have. I would like to share one last question because I believe it's fairly important and interesting for most of our participants today. It's about risks. So, do you see any risks of doing business coming from the government's policy shift compared to China's current COVID measures? Who feel? Yeah. Who wants to take on this one in briefly in 1 minute or two?
Okay, I can give it a shot, trying to analyze geopolitics in 1 minute. No, but very good question, because it is one that keeps coming up basically all the time. I think this perspective is most likely from those with limited operations in Asia. But the way we see it is that right now, there is kind of an alignment of all the stars here in Vietnam, right? So what I talked about in my presentation is that, investment, both from abroad and internally, is going into infrastructure, manufacturing, adding value added in domestic value add in the country, meaning that protecting this kind of growth is something that basically everybody wants to do. And then thus, I think, looking back at the COVID restrictions in Vietnam managed the first wave by, really focusing on just spreading, really containing the first wave of COVID and not having to have restrictions. And then Delta came and wreaked havoc on the country. But still, it was a lockdown to kind of get it under control. And then we have to open back up to keep, our economy growing, to build a better life for all people. And just one final point on the kind of COVID, specifically, the kind of harsh restrictions that are going on in China right now. Yes, Vietnam is similar to China 20 years ago in a lot of ways. You have the same kind of form of government. You have, the same locale, a lot of local traditions and such are shared. But there is one major difference in terms of like geopolitics and how the country can act on the market. And that is that Vietnam cannot become the world's largest economy. It's 14th of the size of China in terms of population. The domestic inner market is going to be big, but it's not going to be the largest country on the planet anytime soon, right? Thus, every person I speak to say that Vietnam have, like for the longest time, had the let's say, spiritual philosophy of being friends with everyone, trying to work together with everyone, but not having to be super dependent on anyone. And thus, I would assume that the government is going to keep trying to supply growth and prosperity for its people, and not become similar to China in that way. But I mean, we're talking decades of societal development, so who knows? Just my 2 cents on that topic.
Thank you, David. All right, we have a question from the chat box. Are there any? Okay, we only have a minute, but let's take it quickly. Are there any Swedish developers interested in renewable energy in Vietnam? There are quite many Nordic investors coming to Vietnam these days for energy investments. Spontaneously, yes. Do you have any further comments on that one? We could definitely elaborate it after this session. David, you want to comment on it?
So if you have any company for this one, please contact me.
Sure, we will do so, Mr. Trang.
Our plan is considering for this.
Okay, absolutely. We'll note that and get back to you after this meeting. Any other comments or questions before closing? All right. Then first of all, thank you. Thanks especially to our guest speakers. So Ms. Bin and Mr. Ziap, thank you for taking your time, and to all participants, all listeners, thank you. I hope you've found the last 1.5 hours interesting. And I would like to stress, as I said from at the start of the meeting, that if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We can probably help you or put you in contact with someone that can. Yeah, I mean, we will continue our activities within this field, and we will for sure continue to map supply chains and do footprint studies for our Swedish companies even in 2023. You can also expect invitations to high-level delegations, and we'll also plan some Swedish pavilions in different exhibitions. So next year will definitely be full of activities. So stay tuned and follow us on our channels and stay in contact with us. Thank you very, very much, and have a nice day to all of you calling in from Sweden, and enjoy the last hour of your afternoon in Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just wanted a dramatic effect there in the end.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.